Hello and welcome to the Data for Subscriptions podcast, where we explore and learn how to run better subscription and as a service businesses. I'm your host, Berat Bonian, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Ron Giuntini to the show. Welcome, Ron.
Welcome. Thank you.
So, Ron, you're the founder of G35 Software and a well esteemed expert in anything as a service.
I am.
Ron, before we get into the topic of today's discussion, which is going to be largely around the pricing strategies and also the requirements and implications it has on usage data management to make sure that that is successful, why don't you talk to us a little bit about your background and basically what made you so passionate to become such an expert in as a service transformations?
Well, I've been involved with the aftermarket for just about 50 years, from manufacturing components for the aftermarket to running an aerospace business unit and working with clients all over the world. Only B2B OEMs I work with. And dealing with the aftermarket, what I noticed that, everything, these were on demand transactions. I mean, but it's the real value in providing a service to a customer is dealing with a longer term service contract. And my first one I did over 40 years ago was dealing with the aerospace industry, which is basically known for power by the hour with Rolls Royce and Pratt and Whitney. And basically, these are 7 to 12 year contracts for maintaining airliner engines, and it's been very successful. Everyone uses that as a case. People forget that those engines are not, they're owned by the airlines. What the OEMs do is provide these long-term service agreements. So I had that. I did it with frequency of landings on gears and also engines. And I moved into multiple industries. I actually developed these programs for the military, which was called performance-based logistics. I dealt with the construction industry, computer industry, just about everything. And what I found that, yeah, in America, you talk about subscription and services, but that was a business model that existed, was a very successful business model in the United States 60, 70 years ago. It was called bundling, like bundling services. OEMs, the best example in history was the United Shoe Machinery Company, where they were the largest manufacturer. They controlled an entire market of manufacturing machines to make shoes. The United States was the biggest shoe manufacturer in the world, and Massachusetts was, and they all used this machine. And what they did was they gave you the machine and they charge you per consumable. Okay. It was a brilliant business model, absolutely dominated. And then in 1953, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that this was unfair to the competition, and they dismembered it under antitrust and killed that program. And bundling, which is subscription and all the services, was a horrible word. You couldn't even use it in American industry. And that went on till late 80s. So it went on for 30, almost 40 years. And then the Supreme Court ruled that as long as the customer is not hurt, then it's okay to bundle. So
Hmm.
all of a sudden, but that left. I mean, if you look at most of the executives, they grew up during the bundling uh, being a bad word. So a lot of those guys, they just walked away from that well into today's world. All right.
Right.
So
Right.
that's evolving now. So we're starting to see that decoupling. People are starting to say, hey, maybe that's not a bad idea. All right. And in the US, they're starting to move towards that. In Europe, you tend to have more empathy for the competition than the consumer all the time. All right.
Right.
You have sort of different laws. But in the United States, that's moving. And the biggest industry right now, which is really exciting, is the whole robotics industry, which is
Right.
exploding and
Yeah.
moving towards. So I'm a
Yeah.
big advocate of this because also, don't take this. To me, the way to stop the Chinese infiltration of the capex market is to bundle everything as a service because they don't know how to deal with services.
Right.
Good.
So there could be knowledge advantage. Also, because of what you just taught us here, is that the days or the roots of as a service in a way goes way further back than I had envisioned myself. So thank you for that. Of course, with today's technology and whether we call that IoT or robotics or AI, we're obviously the last 10, 15 years has been a big, let's say, a buzzword, if we want to call it, or something that really has caught on in terms of momentum. So let's just jump right into it, because we're going to come to some of those cases. You mentioned a few of them. We're going to give more examples of companies that you've been working on with these advanced services. There's a great ebook that we'll also make sure that is linked in the show notes afterwards. But to make sure everybody's on the same page, Ron, when it comes to when we say different pricing strategies when you provide as a service models, why don't we just quickly go through from the least complex to the most complex pricing strategy you could have?
Probably the easiest one is just a subscription, which is basically a fee for providing some kind of resource. Usually, at least in the B2B world, it's like consumables,
Hmm.
or you have a subscription maybe for updates for firmware on equipment. All right, that's probably the simplest. Uh, then you have um, then the usage become then you have usage and then performance combined. So you have a pay per usage, which has to be, again, different industries are have different types of usage patterns. Some have relatively predictable usage, others are all over the place. uh,
Hmm.
you have that, so that's evolving. the that usage The problem with usage is, again, unless it's absolutely flat, then you have variations. So how do you price
Hmm.
something like that? When you price, first of all, pricing has multiple elements. It should, people always talk about value pricing. I'm not wild about. There's value pricing, but there's also value pricing for the customer. There's also value profitability for the supplier. Okay, it has to be both sections. So,
Sure.
pricing, uh, to do pricing, you have to have costing. To do pricing, you also have to have a business model. All right. Again, any one of these products as a service, machines as a service, whatever you want to call it, all right, has to have a business model established. That's hard, all right, because you have different usages. An OEM doesn't have one model; they have multiple models.
Right.
Biggest actual population of their install base are out of production models. All right. So do you know, do you price a product only at the time that it's sold new, attach a contract there, or do you provide at the end of the limited warranty? Do you provide it to other people in the install base who've never had a contract? And pricing uh, is difficult. The question is, what kind of margin do you want? All right. What are your risks? How do you amortize the onboarding of a multi-year contract? I mean, pricing is very difficult. Most marketing people, I mean, my almost universal experience is marketing guy. Customers say, I want a product or service." Marketing goes, "Well, we're going to charge you 5% per year." I go, "Really? Do you have any idea what your costs are?" "Nope, but that's what I'm going to do it." Pricing. There's pricing. Any contract that's over 1 year must be reflected on the balance sheet as a long-term service agreement general ledger account. Okay, it has it's an asset and it's a liability. It has a it has usually one GL number. You have no idea usually if you're making a profit or not on these on an individual basis. So when you say about pricing, most people have no idea if the pricing is going to. This is this is very complex,
Of
you know.
course.
And anyway, to answer your question is there's no easy answer on pricing unless you know what your costing is and your risks are for that particular model and where it is in its life. It's a
Absolutely. Perhaps just to plug in the fact that what you mentioned in terms of you have customers on different types of contracts. Hybrid is what we refer to then, of course, because, and I think this is an important point to make, which probably most of our listeners absolutely understand. They're probably going through the same situation themselves, is that very few companies are running only, say, subscription or only usage based. The reality is that you're running multiple variations for the purpose, and this should, I want to state this as well, is that while, yes, you need to figure out your pricing level based on your costing and your risk analysis and so on. But actually, the main point is, the starting point is the willingness for the customer to pay and what is the best way to serve that customer, which is then directly linked to the pricing strategy that you have, which is what we're going to get into with some of the advanced services, because there is more and more a shift towards this usage based. You mentioned something that I think we should also come back to, which is performance based. I think it's worthwhile to spend a minute on it, because usage based and performance based, while very close, are not necessarily exactly identical. Both are 1,000% contingent on usage data, but they're not the same. But my point here is that there's more and more a shift towards that.
Hmm.
But I think for probably forever, we're going to have a hybrid situation where you're going to
Yeah,
probably have customers still on perpetual or licenses or whatnot, the
right,
one-time transactional model. And on top of that, you have additional.
right. And it's obvious that's what customers want. Every customer wants something else. That's why virtually all of these are customized. All right. There's going to be very few, the old days of gold, silver, bronze, or whatever are gone. All right. At least on the B2B side, and even maybe on the B2C side, that's a whole different world. So
Yep.
when I work with clients, I mean, it's that's why the business model is so if you don't have a business model that can be robustly challenged by a CFO, they'll throw you out and
Mm.
you will never get to first base, as we say in the United States. All right,
Yep.
you're never going to get there.
So let's go to some of these use cases, Ron, because in the ebook that I just referred to a few minutes ago, you've articulated a number of interesting cases that you've identified and also worked with yourself. They of course come with different flavor. But if I would ask you, what are the 2, 3 advanced cases or services that you would like to kind of exemplify when we speak about usage based? Where do you see these? I refer to them as front runner companies, those that are leading the pack, that have been doing this for a while. Run us through the ones that you feel are mostly inspiring to learn from. Which would be the first one?
I'd like simplicity. All right,
Mm,
and especially companies that have proprietary consumables, for example. I work with one company. What they do is they do for all kind of government agencies. They do gunpowder, explosive testing, and inorganic drug testing, especially illegal stuff. All right. So they have a machine that they have consumables, and then you take samples and put in a machine, and it gives you a result. But what they've done is they basically given away their machines, and they just charge per consumable because the consumable has a direct relationship with the usage. All right.
mm,
And they embedded the whole amortization of the machine in the consumables with a minimum. So they sell batches with a certain with a subscription in effect, but repeatable, so that they know within 18 months they paid for the machine and they've made a nice profit. That was very successful, very simple. We try to keep it as simple as possible. One of the big players that's very popular on Wall Street is Intuitive Surgical, where they have robotics for specific surgeries, and they give you the machine, and they have proprietary consumables, and they know that for every consumable sold package sold is an operation. All right. So simple. Try to keep it as simple as possible. Uh, there's um, there's other industries. Again, the big one, the aerospace, is so. in those two examples I gave you, you have the machine as well as the usage uh, combined. All right. You have power by the hour, the airlines, which is the older that's been around since, I guess, the late 60s, early 70s. And the reason why you have these programs, power by the hour, usage based for the aerospace industry, it's hour based, is because when you have new technology, and that was new technology back in the late 60s, jet engines, all right, there's a hesitancy. I mean, the customer base is nervous about the reliability. So the OEM is putting their hand up and going, I will take care of that by assuring you uh, that you're going to have uptime on these machines, and I'm going to charge you per hour of that.
Mm.
So technology, it's like the robotics. People are very nervous about using robotics in manufacturing and warehousing, and in last mile delivery of robotics on the street. So they're going, no problem. I'll guarantee you that I'll meet performance and reliability by charging you per hour of use. All right. And what's beautiful about that their models are replacing humans many times. So, for example, there's uh, one OEM, robotic OEM, that has built surveillance robots that walk around facilities. All
Right.
right. And they charge $8 an hour versus 15 or $18 an hour.
Yep.
But it might cost them $1 an hour. It's irrelevant. Okay. The customer sees the value of saving
Of course.
money. So they use that machine in the New York subway system for security purposes, and it was vandalized and destroyed. But anyway, that's a diversion.
But if I may go back to the first two cases, because if we just take it a little bit stepwise, because the example of the company that was doing drug testing and gunpowder and so on, and basically the machine is given for free, so to say, and pricing then based on consumables based on tracking that usage. You have another case here where I think many of our listeners will probably recognize. We probably have that in their own offices. Office printing. It's one
Right.
of those simple to understand cases. It's been around for quite a while.
Yes.
Xerox is mentioned, for example, here, and HP happens to be two of the customers that we work with. But this is again, I think, a good example of where it's pretty straightforward, but you need to track basically every time the printer is being used. Why? Because and you need to know that with 100% accuracy, because otherwise you will fail to deliver that service. And let's speak in normal terms. If the printer stops working, you're an unhappy customer. You want the printer to be working, you want the ink to be there, everything needs to be working smoothly. For that purpose, you need to be measuring that data accurately. Therefore, you make sure that you maintain that product to the
Right.
standards that you are obliged to for the customer. But this is, I think, despite there is absolutely complexity in that, there are more complex, I think, cases. And one of the ones that I wanted to go to is, again, one that's been around for a while, but excavation, mining, these huge machine, Caterpillar being one of the companies there. Just walk us through how that operates with when you pay for tonnage, for example.
Yeah. It's. You could measure tonnage, or you could measure the number of dumps. Okay, because those, for example, in a large mining operation, those trucks are huge. Okay, they're running 24/7, and they're totally loaded every single time. Okay, so their weight distribution. So what you don't need to really measure, the actual tonnage. All you have to do is know the truck size, and they probably have different truck sizes, and also just the frequency of dumping. All right, I like to keep it simple. All right, so you could put a monitor on a vehicle that just shows you its GPS location, which is a dumping location. Okay, and just track that. There's a lot. The key is, again, the customer must understand how what drives the pricing so that they can audit it themselves. They have
Yeah.
people that sign these contracts have to report to someone. All right. I'll tell you a funny story about that. Okay. Talk about usage, uh, and how that drives the pricing, and how it can cause a lot of problems, actually. I working with one client, we developed this really great program for maintaining a particular machine. And it was a 5-year contract. And we had every incentive because it's remember, you have a fixed price per usage. So you have every incentive as the OEM to find any way to reduce your costs, right? So you can increase your profit if you have a fixed price, right? I mean, that's the incentive that you have as the OEM. So what we did was we created really improved the reliability of the product. So in the past, it had reliability issues, but after about close to 3 years, we had no reliability. So we didn't have any uh, techs going in to fix any problems. Now that caused a problem because leadership's going, wait a second, we're paying every month for pay per use, right? All right, per hour of operation, and you have no techs there. Why are we paying for this? All right.
Right.
We had to explain to them that that was the whole point, performance, right? All
Right.
right. So you can get this got pretty ugly actually because it caused some embarrassment for the operations people who had been involved with the contract in trying to explain to their leadership. But boss, we accomplished what we were trying to do. All right, performance. All right. So
Right.
this is really ugly. I mean, this is every
But I
story,
think,
every situation is a different story, really.
yeah, I mean, I think this ties back to the question you raised before in terms of you need to make sure that your business model is watertight. And by
Absolutely.
that, my view is that sometimes we mix up pricing models with price value. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. This is also why some companies that have been running a variation of subscription and usage-based models, even though being, let's say, more developed, they have had some challenges because ultimately, as a customer, you're still questioning, what am I really paying for?
Right.
But one important point you made when we were discussing the previous case with the mining and excavation and so on is transparency. You said it's important to understand what you're paying for. This, I think, is a very important point to just double click on, because in all the examples of companies that I've witnessed that are successful, the transparency of usage is one such factor. So if we just apply it on the case that you mentioned, being able to, on a real time, basically monitor how much usage is going on is one way for you to basically keep control of your, if you will, cost. Because you know that at certain point, probably end of the month, there will be a bill that is correlated to that usage because there's a unit price for that usage.
Well,
One,
yeah,
yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
I'm sorry. I was just going to bring out the point that that's one of the dilemmas. What I always do is develop a standard usage for the billing purposes
Right.
with then a variance analysis every 6 months or so. So we look at here's how much we're going to bill you, and this may been you may have below that or higher than that, but at least they can go to their bosses because that's what they budget. Remember, they go through a budgeting process, and it's it's hard to describe wild variation. So you have a standard, and then you have a decision, then you have an agreement on how you're going to deal with the variance. Are you going to push it further down the road or eat it? This gets involved with on the OEM side in regards
Yeah.
to revenue recognition issues. It's complex.
Yeah.
Everything's complex.
So we mentioned a couple of basically use cases for this whole stress testing we're doing in terms of how to make sure that you're successful when you're running these kind of pricing models. But one is, of course, for billing. We've discussed, you actually quickly mentioned the whole revenue recognition, which is another one for financial processes. We talked about, quickly at least, touch the fact that capturing that usage data for the product to make sure that your product delivers on point is something that we mentioned. And then we also talked about just transparency towards the customer. But what other basically means and use cases are important to make sure that you accurately track this usage data? One that I have seen myself, and maybe you can just elaborate on it if you've seen the same, is what we refer to as settlement. Because typically what these companies, whether being the examples with the consumables or others, they typically end up having a large sub-supplier base of being able to deliver that service. There are multiple parties involved.
Correct.
Have you seen that as well in the examples that you work with, the
Almost
cases?
uniform, almost always.
Yeah.
All right. An OEM, I use the word obligor. The obligor, the OEM, is the person that designs the product and takes all the risks. All right. And the obligor then chooses who they want to sell the contracts, who's going to actually be the salespeople for the contract. Because a lot of times it's not the OEM, it's their authorized distributors or other people. And then you have the service providers. They have to oversee that. This is not, when you have a contract, there are a lot of players in this thing. All right. And you have to oversee. Most people sign contracts and then they sort of don't do anything about it. There has to be someone overseeing who is delivering these services. And you can have multiple services. I mean, you can have your own organization distributing parts.
Right.
You can have your many times for many products on the product. Remember that most OEMs are not manufacturers, they're assemblers. All right. And most of their parts come from and their subsystems come from suppliers. A lot of times they'll use their suppliers as the provider of the services. So they'll sign contract with them. I mean, you could have, depending on the complexity of the contract, I mean, you could have 5 or 6 different suppliers
Mm.
providing that. But you also, the face of who is providing that service, maybe the person who sold it. All right. But that's not the obligor. Okay. So you have to verify because they're going to go to that person a lot of times and say, I have issues. All right. But you have to coordinate that. This is very challenging. Again, there's some OEMs that sell directly to the end users and others that sell through distribution channels.
Yeah. Now, this space also, from what we've witnessed, can quickly get extremely challenging because if it sounds simple when we speak about it, like, well, you might have parts from 5 different sub suppliers that you bundle in your package and you sell. But then imagine if you give a discount to your customer as the main provider, and then you're supposed to kind of apply that backwards to any of the products. You also mentioned in our discussion that you want to make sure that every customer basically has a customized offering. Well, that in itself, well, if you have 100 or 1,000 customer, and every customer, ideally to serve them well, need to have a customized offering. And let's again keep it simple with 5 different partners that are providing parts in your offering to that customer. We can just quickly do the math. This
It's ugly.
becomes very, very ugly, absolutely unsustainable. I wanted to just kind of pivot a little bit to also how organizations typically deal with this kind of data. In our experience, Ron, there seems to be, since we're still somewhat early days on these kind of business models, there seems to be a fair amount of manual efforts around this, where you just put bodies around them with Excel documents, and people just trying to make sense of all of these data points that we refer to all the time. How much of shift have you seen, and awareness that this needs to be done, maybe automated to offload human errors? How much have you seen? Where are we in that curve?
Well, the tools today, there's really no application software that provides that today. Okay, that enables you to create the business model and to configure cost, price, and quote. And it now on the product configuration, there's a CPQ. I don't know if you've heard,
Sure.
configure price
Sure,
quote,
absolutely.
but that's strictly products. There is no one doing this on services. I mean, I actually G35 software actually was that product. It was actually to configure a contract, but then the pandemic destroyed my business. But life goes on. But there is nothing out there. There's no one doing it that I know of because it's too complex. All right, and an IT person, it would not be able to put it together because you need operational experience on this. IT
But
person with operational people and marketing people and finance people.
right.
It's
Oh,
complex.
when you say that the company's quote to cash kind of system is there to basically solve for that, though, I mean,
Uh,
between CPQ and CRM and the billing system and payments and so
right.
on, isn't that there though to solve it? But I think, the way that I interpret your point is that there is no one system that automatically solves everything, is what you're saying.
There's no, for example, CPQ for products. does that, right? You configure. I mean, it
Sure.
does prices, but there's nothing for a service contract.
Yeah.
Okay, on that. That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
But once you got that, then you can have the revenue recognition issues, and
Yes.
what all the other ancillary software that's available today. It's no big deal because that you just feed into that. It doesn't They don't care if it comes from a CPQ for a product or CPQ for a service
Yeah,
contract.
because what I think is that in order to make these business models work, you need basically the systems that we refer to within quote to cash to be talking to each other on a
Right.
constant basis. And
I agree.
it's simply not a one flow, one direction. It actually is bi-directional. It needs to go back and forth. So when we're, for example, speaking is that we're changing price for a specific unit, that needs to get fed downstream into other systems and vice versa. So this, I think, is from what we've observed is that many companies have really overseen the management of that data that needs to go back and forth, and therefore is trying to kind of catch up with that work by just largely doing it either manually or semi-manually or just using improper tools. One such example is that billing systems are there to do their job, which is to bill,
Right.
but not necessarily manage all of that usage data, because that's why sometimes billing systems are, I would say, incorrectly being blamed for lack of performance. And these billing transmissions that we see constantly, we try to advise many of the companies we work with is just hold off on it. Stay away from a 3-year billing transmission because that might not be your problem.
Almost everyone I deal with use Excel workbooks. I
Yeah.
mean, disgusting. I mean, it's ugly. I mean, really ugly. Because how do you maintain something? It's like any changes or whatever. I mean, almost universal. I have yet to see application software. I've seen people try to use um, CRM software combined with CPQ software, but nothing works. Not on this space, okay, on the B2B space. Some of the B2C space may work because it's a whole different, we're dealing with populations of hundreds of thousands or tens
Sure.
of thousands at least. Here, there's no, the population, there's so much static available in these business models, and the stuff you have to do in regards to mitigate the risk is totally different on the price and profitability. But profitability, one of the reasons I love this field is because we're dealing with profit margins, if done right, can run 25 to 30% profit as a percentage of revenue. Okay,
Yeah.
it's major. I mean, when you look at a typical product generates maybe 7 to 8%, sometimes 10%. Okay, services, parts and services on demand generate maybe 15 to 17% or so. All right, but they're off the chart if done right. If
Yeah.
not done right, you bleed to death. I've seen clients. I mean, you just cut my wrist and let me bleed till I'm unconscious. All right.
No, I think the recurring revenue model is absolutely beyond serving a customer need in a better way potentially than the traditional perpetual models or one-time sales. Uh, it definitely comes with the upside of being quite, let's say, profitable, more so than the traditional model. That being said, the I've also seen that the trap is the inefficiencies, especially when you scale the business. It's one thing when you start off small, but from all the examples that we gave today, these are businesses that have scaled. And as soon as you start to scale, it creates enormous amount of volumes and therefore cost.
It's one of the funny things about this whole area, which I found to be uh, the self interest of people. When you're dealing with a salesman, they're looking at selling a product, okay, but and then so you're selling a product for, let's say, $100, and then you have a service contract that maybe $20, okay. So where are they going to focus their efforts on their commission? They're going to focus it on the product. So what I've done, and successfully, is we double, sometimes even triple the commissions that people get for a contract, because then you have the present value. So you have to look at the total profit streams over the life of of the contract, which can be very, very attractive. So they have an incentive to start pushing contracts. And
Mhm.
so something as simple as that can make a huge difference in regards to getting that visibility you need for these service long-term service contracts and service contracts.
Ron, we're going to take one question here now, and before we start to wrap it up. But if we go to the question from Clinton, um, as evident on the screen here, what metrics and KPIs should we track to ensure that our as a service pricing model is driving both profitability and customer satisfaction?
Well, in regard to profitability, that's on the balance sheet. Okay, I mean, you remember you have a general ledger account for revenue for assets, which is the revenue side, the predicted revenue side of the contract, and then you have the liabilities, which are your future costs. So it's right there on the financial point of view. You have these are all GL postings, so you can measure that. On the performance side, obviously, whatever the service requirements are. For example, the duration of downtime. All right, what is it going to be for for unplanned for a failure, for example? How fast am I going to respond to that? That's a KPI. Is it you got you got the duration, and the duration is going to be built upon you providing the text and the service, if that's and the parts, if that's the case, or just how fast you ship the parts out. I mean, there's a bunch of KPIs you can do uh, for, for that. It's respond. Most of the time it's response time to reduced downtime if you're dealing with on the reliability side or delivering parts. There's a zillion KPIs, but what's really important is that the financials are all reflected on the balance sheet. And this is where this gets really ugly because you can play all kind of games in regards to how you recognize revenue and how you recognize cost. But then you have to pay a price when the contract's over if they're not in balance. All right. That so I would spend time on the general ledger account.
Ron, as a final advice to everybody who has been listening to us today, would all the cases and the companies that you see have been running and scaling their as a service business well? I mean, effectively, it's profitable, it's done efficiently internally as well. What is the what are the two things we need to get right? What is your message to every business out there that kind of want to run their as a service business more effectively?
You have to have a business model that I call has gone through stump the chump. That means that you've presented it, you've been beaten up by this chief financial officer, you got beaten up by as many people as you can to make sure that that business model is reasonably robust and minimizes the risk to yourself as the obligor or the OEM, and also provides the value to the customer. That's the first thing you do.
Mhm.
And the second is just overseeing. You have to have someone overseeing these contracts who understands operations, not a financial accountant. They're worthless. Don't take this personally, but they're not the people to do this. All right. It has to be someone who's in the service organ, understands finance, but also understands what it takes to onboard these programs and then deliver the performance that was promised the customer.
Excellent. Ron, thank you so much for your time and the
Thank,
conversation. Greatly appreciate it. And thank you,
thank you very
everybody,
much.
for tuning in.
Okay, great. Take care.